Hey everyone, Mr. Davitt here. Happy Christmas winter break. Depending on when you're watching this, maybe Christmas has already come or maybe it's on the horizon. But either way, off of school. This is our first of three lessons dedicated to the Civil War that we're doing over the Christmas winter break. So this is taking place for the causes of the U.S. Civil War. Once again, a kind of a continuation of what we've already started on. And then next time we'll actually move into the first part of the war, and then we'll follow by looking at the later part of the actual fighting and things like that. Um, Again, though, for understanding the Civil War, so much of this is about the causes, and we spent time talking about the institution of slavery specifically. We've looked at sectionalism, we've looked at westward expansion and the trouble that that brought about, and we looked at early 1850s, late 1840s, but now we're going to segue into more specifically kind of the remainder of the 1850s and just how dramatic the split is going to get between the North and the South. I'll start though by kind of reminding you what we've kind of gone over a little bit specifically. So we know that the Compromise of 1850 did attempt to solve some of the issues and the problems, but the reality is it is going to lead to more contention and issues. I mentioned this a little bit when we were going over the Compromise of 1850, but I kind of mention it again. The big problem is going to be with that Fugitive Slave Act. That's going to draw a lot of contention. And early on, the North wasn't incredibly receptive in actually enforcing it. But as time continues, that will become even more of basically a Northern disregard for the act, especially after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which again institutes this idea of popular sovereignty and, leaves open the prospect of slavery expansion, which once again is going to be really angering to Northerners. Again, popular sovereignty seems like it might be an okay idea, but the reality is it brings up way too many potential for problems. Again, you are now allowing basically an opportunity for slavery to increase. So that's going to, as we know, lead to contentions and problems and things like that. And you're also kind of throwing out this right to the people that is not a right that has traditionally been given to the people. This has been a right that's been reserved for the federal government to come up with and things like that. And so you're kind of messing around with things by doing something like this. So contentious is the Kansas-Nebraska Act that a new political party will literally emerge directly, basically, as a result, and that will be the Republican Party. And we'll talk more about the Republican Party in this lesson, but just a reminder, the Republican Party is the party of free soil. They do not want slavery to expand. However, they are not an abolitionist party. They do not necessarily want to get rid of slavery where it already exists. So just something to kind of keep in mind as that idea or that belief will somewhat change. Republicans and many in the North feared very much what's referred to as a slave power conspiracy. And this was just like in the South, where kind of that planter aristocracy ran supreme. The kind of planter aristocracy was taking over key parts of the federal government. They had the ear of the president. They had taken over the Supreme Court and things like that. And their sole mission was to make sure slavery not only continued, but even expanded. And again, we'll talk more about this as this goes on. Again, it's not necessarily a real thing, but certainly there were many within definitely state governments in the South, but more importantly, the federal government that did support slavery and its expansion. This image, if you recall, is a call to colored people of Boston, and this has a lot to do with the Fugitive Slave Act and what was allowed, which was federal troops and others to come into the North and capture fugitive slaves. We kind of talked about this. In reality, not many slaves will actually be removed from the North and return back to the South. Um, that being said, though, the act itself is going to be contentious enough to draw a lot of criticism and other types of things like that. Something that's going to come about in the 1850s as we look at actual causes of the Civil War, now moving kind of more specifically into short term events, is going to be some new abolitionist literature, which is going to reach numbers that the early abolition movement really had failed to reach. The first and kind of most well read of the abolitionist literature books that will come out is from a Northern woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and in 1851 she'll begin to publish in weekly installments a collection of a story known as Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book was entirely fiction, but it was an extremely heartfelt story, and it talked about a slave known as Uncle Tom and his treatment as he goes through slavery. And it culminates in the end with actually him being killed because he refuses to tell his master the whereabouts of a mother and daughter slave who escaped. So it will grip a lot of people who read it, and really show kind of the horrors of slavery, but in kind of an easier way to understand it through this fictional story. If you remember, we talked about someone like William Lloyd Garrison who comes up with The Liberator, and we talked about how the early abolition movement struggled in the sense that not that many people read something like The Liberator or something like that. Uncle Tom's Cabin is very different than that, in the sense that in its first year, it will sell over 300,000 copies, and in the lead up to the Civil War by 1860, it had sold well over 2 million. So again, this is now reaching a readership that the early abolition movement was never able to do. Stowe claims she wrote the book with firsthand knowledge. The reality is she did not. She had not really gone into the South and didn't know an extraordinary amount about slavery other than what her imagination could resound with. But it doesn't necessarily matter because people still read, they're still motivated, and it's going to contribute to more anti-slavery feeling in the North as more people read the story and feel like, wow, this is just horrible what's going on and what's happening in this regard. This book will also reach popularity in Britain and France, and I bring that up because that's going to kind of come into play a little bit later, especially as Britain had already gotten rid of slavery and was kind of trying to distance themselves from that. So again, even an international readership, which is pretty fascinating. There's a story, and it's mostly been described as actually not happening, but once the Civil War started, that Abraham Lincoln met with Harriet Beecher Stowe and said to her, "Oh, you're the little old lady that started the U.S. Civil War." Again, most accounts now think this meeting never happened, but either way, just the fact that that story arises signals to us that this book was well read, and its story and readership alone is going to help contribute to the United States Civil War. Another book comes out that isn't necessarily to the same scope of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but still pretty significant, which is known as The Impending Crisis of the South. This was more argument-based, but basically what its author, Hendon Harper, tried to argue was that slavery was actually bad for non-slave-holding whites, and basically they suffered the most out of this system. Kind of a fear here by the planter aristocracy in the South after this book is written that maybe non-slave-holding whites would try to retaliate against them. So, and once again, kind of similar to Uncle Tom's Cabin, more people read this and other stuff like that. So we're once again kind of seeing just how significant something like this can move itself into. Again, here we see a cover for Uncle Tom's Cabin, a poster soliciting its sale, and again we see this massive readership, even going so much here to say the greatest book of the age. This, by the way, is a depiction of Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe as they supposedly met, which we don't think they actually did. And then this actually a monument that's been built to commemorate this meeting, which again, we don't really actually think happened, but whatever. Still, again, significant in just how important this whole thing will be. Okay, so then let's return now to Kansas. And we know popular sovereignty has been decided due to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and now there's an opportunity for Kansas to either become a slave state or a free state. I want to start by saying this, which was that there were huge stakes for both free soilers as well as advocates of slavery to get their way over in Kansas. All right, if you're from the South and you're a proponent of slavery, this is your opportunity to expand slavery, okay, and thus, kind of keep the discussion alive that new territory could be open to slavery. If you're a free soiler, this is maybe your opportunity to stop the spread of slavery if it stops in Kansas as far as new territories are concerned. And again, there was a big fear in the South that if Kansas did not become a slave state, then maybe there would be no more slave states anymore. Well, because of that and because of kind of the high stakes that are going to be in place, both sides will try to influence events in the region in order to kind of get their way. And again, because it's a popular vote that they're going to decide slavery or not, that's really what this comes down to, is basically at the ballot box through voter fraud and other things like that. But let me kind of rewind there and kind of explain a couple of the things that happen. In the North, there's going to be a company that emerges known as the New England Emigrant Aid Company, and this will send about 2,000 people, over to the Kansas area. And this was done kind of to make a profit, but it was also kind of done in order to try to influence some of the events going on there. Again, like I said, only about 2,000 people, not incredibly big, but eventually Kansas will be settled, and then they're going to have the vote to decide on slavery. And on the day of the vote, numerous Southerners, especially from their neighbor Missouri, will come in and vote in support of a pro-slavery constitution. As a result, pro-slavery will win in the vote. However, hugely contested election to the point where, again, obviously, you have extreme voter fraud going on as people have voted in a state they don't belong to. Literally, they're going to cross the border into Kansas. They're going to vote and then return home. So that's obviously really, really serious. So much so that there are more votes cast than actually people living in the region. So, as could be guessed, this is not going to be a situation that's going to be well accepted. Because of that, there's going to be two competing governments in Kansas that will arise, both of which claiming legitimacy, yet neither one having the entire support of the state and things like that. So the pro-slave government will set themselves up in Lecompton, Kansas, and then the free state side will put themselves up in Topeka. And literally what we have here is a situation where we have these two competing governments existing in the state, and really no kind of direction of what's going to happen here, neither side willing to back down. It's actually absolute madness occurring in the state. So much so does this go on that violence will erupt. We kind of see this in the image, but specifically in the town of Lawrence, where some pro-slavery groups will come in and burn down some buildings and other things like that. And in response, one of the kind of most intense abolitionists who will really gain fame in Kansas, will go and come on and attack some of the pro-slave people and actually kill them. All right. Again, this is literally insanity that this is occurring in the state where literally we have violence and this type of action occurring. Violence and tensions will continue in Kansas, and we'll talk about not really necessarily the resolution, but this will kind of continue on. And the reality is the Civil War, in many senses, kind of the preview of it occurs in Kansas as, again, we have these kind of two competing governments, both claiming legitimacy, yet really neither having any, going up and fighting against one another. So this is going to be a really, really convoluted situation and almost like a Civil War preview. Here we see some of the other violence and taking place here. Again, as both sides will really go out of their way to kill the other side. And then here's a depiction of John Brown. He largely coordinated this with his son, and we're going to talk about John Brown a little bit later because in many ways, John Brown is a huge starter of the U.S. Civil War. But again, in Kansas, he literally kind of puts this quest on killing people that are pro-slavery, some of the big ones. Again, just craziness. And there is, by the way, no law, no order in Kansas. It's literally like a state of war. Okay, to just show how depraved the situation is and how insane it is, this issue will even reach the congressional floor in an incident that's been termed as Bleeding Sumner. So in the Senate, a senator by the name of Charles Sumner, he's from Massachusetts, will give a speech. And in this speech, he makes an aggressive attack against another senator, this senator from the South, Butler, who was from South Carolina. And again, the attack was pretty clear, the verbal kind of speech and attack, it was pretty obvious that, this was not meant to be nice or anything like that. He had legitimate issues and problems with him. In response, the nephew of Senator Butler who was also a congressman, Preston Brooks, will see Sumner and attack him literally on the congressional floor and beat him so bad, and that's what this is showing here, with his cane, that his cane broke. Okay, again, think about how ludicrous this is. We talk about this today, the fighting between, Republicans, Democrats. Very much there is a lot, but imagine what kind of shock you would be if you heard about a congressman attacking another congressman. But in the 1850s, that actually happens. Just a sign of how absurd the times are. For the North, this is an extremely sad attack. Again, Sumner becomes kind of somewhat of a martyr here for, Southern aggression and all the rest of this type of stuff. In the South, Brooks will be displayed as a hero, especially for the real pro-slavery forces. So much so that they're actually going to send canes to Brooks in order to commemorate his attack and things like that. Again, insanity, 100%, but just showing how insane the times have gotten. And again, this image is a good depiction, and we see here Southern chivalry, argument versus clubs. Again, this is what happens as tensions just get so extreme and so intense. Okay, so amidst all this craziness, it is 1856. Every 4 years, we're scheduled for a presidential election, and now there's going to be no difference here in 1856. If you remember, the Democrat was Franklin Pierce in 1852. He was elected president. Pierce was extremely unpopular, and even today, Pierce goes down as being one of the worst presidents in American history. Again, remember, he was a pro-slavery Northerner. He, had to put the Ostend Manifesto together in order to try to acquire Cuba. Again, just not good stuff. So the Democrats will not decide to put him up for re-election. Instead, they decide to go with this man that you see here in the picture. This is James Buchanan. James Buchanan was from Pennsylvania. So, one of those middle states, a battleground state in 1856. What made Buchanan intriguing and electable was the fact that he had experience in government, about 4 decades worth of public experience in public service experience in the government. And again, he was also from Pennsylvania, which was a key battleground state. And so again, for the Democrats, they're going to say, okay, this guy seems good. He's also going to be pro-slavery, so he kind of works as a balance, sort of similar to Pierce, but we're going to see Buchanan have a lot of kind of issues himself, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. The Republicans, who again have just kind of emerged only a couple years before this, and this is their first presidential election, will decide to put up John Fremont. You might recognize that name. John Fremont was one of the big people in the Mexican-American War. Fremont, a war hero, which is obviously nice, but the problem with Fremont is the fact that he really doesn't have much political experience at all. So as a result, he won't exactly garner enough votes. This election is also significant for another reason, which is that we see the emergence of the anti-immigrant Know Nothing Party, which we've kind of referred to as before. So we have kind of this weird thing in 1856 where we have the two main parties, but then we also have, and again, the issue is, slavery and North versus South and whatever else, but then we kind of throw the immigrant thing in there because, the growth of immigrants that have occurred. And again, we kind of talked about the Know Nothing Party as that anti-immigrant group, but they do put up a candidate for election, largely due to the still early times of the Republican Party, as well as the fact that they put up John Fremont, who really lacked any legitimate political experience. Buchanan will win the presidency in 1856. With that being said, though, and I'm going to show you the electoral map in just one sec, the fact that the Republicans do gain a pretty respectable amount of votes is very promising for a political party that's just a little over 2 years old at this time. So again, there's a lot of promise right away for, again, like I said, this kind of new political party, because they're able to do pretty well in just their first presidential election. And by the way, they're picking up House seats and congressional seats and stuff like that. Okay, so here's Buchanan. I'll get to this a little bit more, but Buchanan, I said Pierce is one of the worst. Buchanan usually gets listed as the worst, or again, like bottom 2, bottom 3, and you're going to kind of see why, which is that at a monumental time, as the country will veer closer and closer towards civil war, he not only does nothing to solve the problem, he just makes things even worse. So that's obviously extremely problematic. This is your electoral map of 1856. You can see here the Democrats sweeping the South, but they're still picking up, decent amount of states in the, middle area and the Midwest and stuff like that. But the Republicans, a very good showing up in the northern area. So if you're the Republicans, you're kind of looking and saying, okay, if we can expand the vote more south into just, like areas like Pennsylvania and, Indiana and Illinois, that will help us, and that can kind of get us to where we need to go. So again, though, a good showing. All right, I need to talk to you about one of the most monumental Supreme Court decisions in American history. And this has to do with this man right here, whose name is Dred Scott. And again, there are so many Supreme Court cases that occur, but the reality is we only talk about some of them. And, the ones that we do talk about then are extremely significant for a whole lot of different reasons. So anyways, let me kind of talk to you about what occurs here. So Dred Scott was a slave. However, he had accompanied his master to Illinois and then to Wisconsin. So what that meant was that he had literally gone with his master to a free state and a free territory. And then he returned back to his master to Missouri, a slave state. Well, here's what's going to happen. Dred Scott's going to say, wait a minute, I was moved to a free state. I was moved to a free territory. Wouldn't that mean I'm free? So he's going to sue for his freedom. And again, it will be ruled by local courts and state courts, and there'll be a lot of back and forth. And then finally, it's so contentious and so much back and forth whether or not he was free or slave and things like that. It will actually make itself all the way up to the Supreme Court. Okay, so his argument is presented, things like that. Again, his freedom does seem relatively valid. It does seem like a valid claim, right? I mean, if slavery only exists in the slave states, yet he moved to a free state and a free territory, shouldn't he be free? No, wrong. And this is the decision of the Supreme Court. Why does the Supreme Court come up with this decision? Well, a few things to keep in mind. Remember, there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 5 of the 9 in 1857, which is when this case is heard, are from the South. So there is a Southern majority of the justices. Their decision actually is 7-2 in favor of not granting Dred Scott his freedom. The Supreme Court Chief Justice at this point, Roger Taney, will issue his decision. And again, the reason why Supreme Court cases are so instrumental are not necessarily because of the individuals who make up the case, much more so having to do with the fact that their effects and what is said kind of set a precedent. So what kind of occurs here? Well, Taney in his decision will say that blacks or slaves or I guess had no rights which were bound to be respected. So actually the fact that Dred Scott was even in a court suing for his freedom, Taney's going to say, no, he doesn't have the right to do that. Wow, that is extreme. Taney will also continue to say a master had the ability to move their property wherever they so wanted. So in this case, the fact that he was a slave, it didn't matter. All right, so this is also something that is problematic. Northerners and Republicans will be so put off by this situation. And again, going back to what I said at the beginning of the lesson, this idea of the slave power conspiracy and stuff like that, now all of a sudden Republicans are saying, look what happened. Okay, we have the Supreme Court ruling so much in favor of the South. This is unbelievable. Kind of an interesting story, just kind of a side note. There'll be so much pressure on kind of Dred Scott's master and whatever else that actually Dred Scott will be freed shortly after the trial and things like that. But again, that's not the point. The point is that the Supreme Court has said clearly here that, this is no problem, and basically slaves were stuck. And by this logic, by Taney, this could basically mean that a slave could be moved into any free state and free territory, and that was totally allowed, which obviously was not supposed to be the way things were. Again, this should come as no surprise that I finish with this point, which is just kind of this lends itself to more tension, more issues, more problems, as again, things are getting much, much more contentious, and that divide between North and South is growing. Here's Taney, and here's some of the things that are said. Blacks had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. So basically he's saying right here, hey, he doesn't even have a right to sue for his freedom or anything like that. Kind of an egregious claim, to say the least. And then it will be admitted on all hands that with the exception of powers surrendered by the Constitution, the people of the several states are absolutely and unconditionally sovereign within their respective territories. This basically would be continuing to kind of open the ball for slavery to continue to expand. Okay, I want to go back to Kansas real quick and kind of tell you what occurs there. And as you might guess, it is just straight up madness. So there's going to be a new governor that's going to come into the state in the later part of the 1850s, and he kind of restores a little bit of, I don't know, normalcy, I guess, and order, but still a tense and tight situation. At this point, the Free Staters make up a majority of the people living in the state. So if they decide to have an election, a legitimate one this time, then it's going to be okay. It's like, okay, slavery is not going to be put in Kansas. Well, the Lecompton Constitution will put the Lecompton government, which remember was the pro-slavery one, will put up a proposal for Kansas to be into statehood. And because they put up the proposal, the Free Staters, although making up the majority, will decide not to get themselves involved in this. And so naturally, the pro-slave victory will happen. Okay, however, as they look at the results, once again, there's extreme fraud, there's extreme issues with the results, and they're very illegitimate. Okay, and again, the question of whether or not the Lecompton Convention in the first place should have put up the proposal, they probably shouldn't have at all because they were there illegitimately themselves, but technically they had seen themselves as the elected representatives. Crazy. So this will go on hiatus a little bit. Say, okay, and then they'll draw up another proposal. And this proposal for statehood had two options: either for the state to accept slavery, or for the state to not have slavery, but any slave that was already there was protected. All right. Well, now the Free Staters are very angry and very upset because they're saying, hey, listen, this isn't the way it's supposed to go. It's not supposed to be like 100% slavery or like 50, 75% slavery. It's either supposed to be slavery or no slavery. So that's what we need to vote on. So they will decide to boycott the election as they see this as being extremely unfair. The governor of Kansas at this point, again, tough spot for so many reasons. He wants federal help, federal assistance, whatever else. So he's going to kind of plea over to Buchanan and say, hey, I need you to denounce this Lecompton Constitution, and because, it's not right and things like that. And, it's not the way things will go. And Buchanan, being pro-slavery and also just being a poor leader as a whole, will do nothing. And so as a result, things will continue to go crazy in Kansas. The kind of ill action of the pro-slave side will increase support of Republicans. We're also going to see kind of more of a division among Democrats, and we already kind of saw this, but especially because Northern Democrats will feel so alienated by their party that they're going to start to gravitate towards the Republicans. Because they will feel like the Democrats are just obsessed with slavery, and that's not really what they wanted. So, again, that split, almost should be no surprise, but that's going to be the way things go. The good news is that even though the president will not act, the House of Representatives will, and they'll reject the proposal outright. And when the election is finally run fairly, Kansas will be admitted as a free state in 1861. That being said, though, kind of the damage has already been done. They've already had, again, like I said, like basically a mini civil war in Kansas over this slave-free issue. Again, here we see some signs for a protest of the Lecompton Constitution, which again, or the proposed one that had slavery existing, even though not necessarily the will of the people. Again, like I said earlier, this lends itself to kind of what we would refer to as a mini civil war. Okay, amidst all of this, there's going to be another financial crash. To be honest, this crash that occurs in 1857 is not nearly as bad as in, like 1837 or even 1819. But amidst everything going on, it's just very, very poor timing and psychologically draining. The other issue is that the North will be hit the hardest, and the South will actually end up being kind of okay. So, and again, sometimes this happens where a specific region is affected more by a financial crash than another. That should be no surprise in the 1850s, given the differences of economy between the two. But with that being said, with all this conflict and sectionalism going on, this does not make things any better, and instead only makes things far, far worse. Um, One of the things that you have to realize, and why the South is okay, has to do with the fact that cotton will remain king in the South and really throughout the world. And because of its prominence and because of its desire and demand, the South will be okay. And so, again, we'll kind of return to that theme in the next lesson. The crash of 1857 will lend itself to the tariff of 1857, which will lower tariff rates very, very low, the lowest basically since 1812. Again, Northerners generally were more favorable towards a higher tariff. It protected their industry, and so with the passage of this, they're going to be continued to be upset and angry about the situation that's occurred. Okay, against this backdrop, there's something going on in the state of Illinois that is worthy of mention. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is where we're going to see kind of the emergence of a new kind of major leader, Abraham Lincoln. So, in the Senate race of 1858, which will basically garner national spotlight, we have Stephen Douglas against Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln at this point, a little bit of stuff in politics, but really for the most part was a lawyer, had a pretty successful law practice, and because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he decided to get back kind of into more serious politics. Again, he's a Republican, and we talk about these Republicans that are motivated to join the Republican Party because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He is absolutely one of them. And so, again, significant to kind of look at there. The two will have a series of debates for this Senate spot. And again, if you remember, Stephen Douglas is an advocate of popular sovereignty, so he will preach that. And then Lincoln is a Republican, so he's a believer in free soil. To be honest, a lot of these debates were kind of close in thought. Again, there's just a little bit of difference. Again, popular sovereignty versus, the free soil stuff. But Lincoln will call slavery morally wrong, which Douglas will never quite do. And again, Douglas isn't necessarily pro-slavery. If you remember, Douglas's motivations are more so constructing, or I guess settling the land so Chicago can be kind of the main terminal of the Transcontinental Railroad. Probably the most significant debate between the two occur in Freeport, and at the Freeport debate, there's kind of a back and forth going on, and it's in this back and forth that Douglas will preach what has become known as the Freeport Doctrine. And basically what this said was, and what Douglas said was that basically popular sovereignty was the most important factor in determining slavery. So popular sovereignty had given the right of the people to extend slavery, but it also gave the power of the people the right to limit slavery in a place as well. Again, pretty interesting kind of viewpoint here, but kind of showing where Douglas was here in this power of popular sovereignty and things like that. In these debates, Lincoln is rising to prominence. However, Douglas will win. This shouldn't necessarily be a surprise because Douglas was kind of the veteran and he had been around for a while. Lincoln more of the newcomer, so it shouldn't be too big of a surprise that he loses at this point. But at the same time, now all of a sudden there's a little bit more of a name in the national political scope of Abraham Lincoln. And people kind of know, Abraham, who is this guy? And there's some familiarity there, which is significant to kind of consider and think about there. The Democrats will also become more divided here. Again, this has a lot to do with those that were opposed to, popular sovereignty, and kind of felt, again, that the party was becoming kind of a slavery party. And also, again, Southern Democrats who felt that kind of Stephen Douglas wasn't doing enough to back slavery with popular sovereignty. It was like too middle, basically. They wanted somebody that was much more an advocate for slavery than anything else. Okay, and here we see the two debating this little picture that's been grown here. Again, Abraham Lincoln, always known as a good orator, a good speaker, articulate, well thought out. Again, people see that in the debates that take place. Okay, one of the big precursors to the Civil War is actually going to occur due to John Brown, who, if you remember, I told you about when we were talking about Bleeding Kansas, in the sense that he's an ultimate abolitionist. He feels like it is his mission to get this stuff together, and again, even so, killing some pro-slavery forces over in Kansas. John Brown's thinking about next steps here, and now we're in 1859, and he decides to hatch a plan with his sons and some other people to raid a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. A federal arsenal would be where basically there's a stockpile of weapons for the military and stuff like that, and there happens to be one at Harper's Ferry. Why does he want to raid it? Well, his plan is to take the weapons, him and his sons and the crew, and then pass them out to slaves, and then the slaves could start a slave revolt. Okay, remember, this was a big fear of Southerners, the fear of a slave revolt, but it was really hard to coordinate being a slave. However, this could help where you could have, this group coordinating and planning and all the rest of that type of stuff. So the crew arrives down at the arsenal, and the plan is not really well hatched out. And almost immediately when they come in, they are met with some issues as a train pulls in, and then shots were fired, and all of a sudden some of his crew is already killed, and Brown will escape, and he will seek refuge in the arsenal as all of a sudden the troops and stuff go after this crew for literally trying to take control of the arsenal. Another problem, by the way, with this plan was that, again, they were trying to start a slave revolt, but they had not told any slaves of their intentions, nor, and this is kind of an interesting one, were there actually many slaves directly in this area. I'm going to kind of show you a look at it, but again, it was not like some deep south plantation area. It was literally surrounded by mountains and kind of secluded, so it's really not a great plan. For 36 hours, John Brown hides out and takes refuge in the Arsenal's fire engine house. He threatens to kill hostages and other things like that. And finally, Robert E. Lee will come in and capture him. So he's taken into custody, and he will be placed on trial for treason, which is a capital offense. So if he is found guilty, he will be put to death. His lawyers try to convince him to plead insanity. However, he refuses to plead insane, instead decides to face trial where he's found guilty because he did do these things. It's not really a question of that. And in many senses dies kind of a martyr for the abolitionist cause. Why is this so significant? Well, a few things to keep in mind. One is that this, for the South, is their nightmare come true. They were always worried about slave revolts. And again, in many areas, slaves outnumbering whites. But again, because of the restrictions and things like that, it was very hard for there to be any significant coordination. Well, now, all of a sudden, you've had somebody, a free person, try to start a slave revolt. Again, this would mean it could be a lot more successful if that was the case. For hardcore abolitionists, John Brown is a hero. And again, definitely a martyr in many senses. I also put a martyr for the cause here because there's been some speculation through historical research and things like that, that maybe John Brown actually did this on purpose and was looking to get caught and wasn't actually trying to be successful here because he saw himself as being more valuable through his death of this cause than through the North. So, through him being alive. So again, really interesting type of thing that's gone on here. Because again, like I said, this plan is not well hatched out and it fails almost immediately. Here we see John Brown. And then here we see another one in this regard. And again, here is the firehouse where he holds out. Here's him being put to death. And then this is an image of Harper's Ferry. And I wanted to show you this because you can see here that if you're trying to start a slave revolt and you're trying to go into a place quickly and come out quickly with weapons and things like that, this would probably be one of the last places you would pick. There's all this mountain and Appalachians that they have to go through. There's other things going on here. It's a beyond nightmare. So this is something that, again, have made many people think that maybe he wasn't necessarily trying to be successful. And, that's something significant to kind of consider and look at. Okay, so let's look at the election of 1860 then, which, if you want to talk about elections, this is one of the most monumental ones. So first off, the Democrats at this point by 1860 are split. And that's because there's kind of your moderate Democrats, Northern Democrats, and then you have your hardcore Southern Democrats. So the Democrats are going to put up two candidates for office. Stephen Douglas, again, the advocate for popular sovereignty. So not against slavery expanding, but he feels like it needs to be done so through the will of the people. And then the other candidate being John Breckinridge, who was actually from the South and who the Southern Democrats felt was their real advocate for the full-scale expansion of slavery. So the Republicans have an opportunity here. Number one, the Republicans have become more popular as the kind of later part of the 1850s have come in. The Democrats are divided, obviously, and the prior Democrat president, James Buchanan, again, is extremely unpopular, so they just need to put up a solid candidate that they think will do good stuff. The most logical candidate would be William Seward. However, he has basically too many enemies at this point, so the Republicans say, hey, you know what, we need to go another way here. And they decide to go with Abraham Lincoln. Again, not extremely experienced as far as political concern, but at the same time, a successful lawyer. He's gotten a little bit of a name for himself through the Illinois Senate races, and again, and also, by the way, because he's not necessarily as experienced, he does not necessarily have the level of enemies that someone like Seward did, which was quite a lot. So this is something to kind of consider, and why Lincoln comes in as the Republican candidate. The Republicans are clear on their belief on slavery, which was that there should be no expansion of slavery. Okay, but they didn't really feel like they were going to do anything about where slavery already existed. So that was what they kind of felt as being the case. By the way, they have other kind of elements of their platform, but for our purposes, I really want to focus on that no expansion of slavery part here. There also will be kind of another random third party, so technically fourth candidate, the Constitutional Union Party, who put up Bell for election. And once everything is set and done, largely due to the Democrat split, but also, again, Lincoln does a nice job himself campaigning and cementing himself and whatever else you want to say. Lincoln does win the election in 1860. So we have now officially our first Republican president. Okay, Lincoln has said, I don't want slavery to expand. It's what the Republicans have said. But for the South, Lincoln's victory spells the end of slavery for them. And so what's going to start to happen is they're going to start having secessionist conventions, special conventions called to discuss concessions, and then very shortly they will start seceding, literally breaking away from the United States, and they do so for the protection of slavery. And again, it's very, and also its expansion. And again, we hear that, we know that based on the speeches that were made at these conventions. I put that it's an unjustified Southern response because of exactly what was said, which was that Lincoln, again, did not want to end slavery. He just didn't want it to expand. But he was willing, at least in some way, to kind of keep it where it already existed and kind of return to that at a later point. But the South will feel like that is just not good enough for them. Almost immediately, so basically within about 2-ish months after Lincoln's election, 7 of the 15 southern states will secede. And I'll show you them on a map, but this is like the deep South states. So something to kind of keep in mind there. Here we see Abraham Lincoln. Again, their protection to American industry. This was actually another kind of point of this, which was a higher tariff, but not really too concerned about that. But then here we see free territory. And again, that's going to be the big rallying cry for the Republicans and for Lincoln. But that's not going to sit well with the South. Here, by the way, we see a breakdown of the vote, and you can see here just how extremely this is so sectional. Okay, you have basically the very deep southern states voting for Breckinridge. Then we have some votes for the Constitutional Union Party. You see Douglas actually does not do very well. That has a lot to do with the fact that, again, you know, the hardcore Democrats are going to vote for Breckinridge, and that kind of leaves him in kind of a weird limbo and stuff like that. And then, obviously, Lincoln taking the North and the middle areas. And, by the way, I'll return to this when we get to the start of war, but just so you can see this, the first states that secede are these big states down in the Deep South. And this is where we know slavery was most important. And in some of these places like Mississippi and South Carolina, there were more slaves than whites. These other states will all have slavery, the kind of light blue, teal, whatever that is, and then this gray area. But again, we'll move to that a little bit later into how exactly that goes. But they do not secede right away. And that's where we'll wrap this up. Not at war yet, but obviously very close by early 1861. So what exactly happens? Well, remember, there's been issues like this before. Not as severe as what happens right after the election of 1860, but there's been stuff that's happened to where there's been crisis, and each time crisis has been averted. How? Compromise and coming together and things like that. So at this point, we don't really have war because the upper South states had not seceded. I'll put yet there because they will kind of soon, but because they haven't, there's still an opportunity to maybe figure this out. There's a problem, though, which is the fact that the election takes place in November and Lincoln doesn't take over until March. So there's this period where Buchanan serves as a lame duck president. And the hope here is, hey, listen, let's, let Buchanan do something. Again, you're still the president right now. You should do something. Well, this should be as no surprise because he hasn't done anything up to this point when he was actually president. Now that he's a lame duck president, he doesn't do anything either. So once again, this is problematic and really kind of a bad situation that develops. There's one kind of final compromise that's going to be put on the table, which is known as the Crittenden Compromise and named after this man, Crittenden. What Crittenden came up with was a compromise that would have protected slavery south of the 3630 line across the country, basically, so would have put that into place. There's some other things about it, and I'll show you this in a map in just a little bit, but the reality is the compromise is rejected. So this is not going to work itself out, as it doesn't really do enough for either of the sides, who, by the way, are mostly unwilling to compromise at this point. In February 1861, there will be a peace convention that meets in Virginia to talk about the potential maybe for trying to see if, they could bring the seceded states back into the Union. The problem is, though, of the states that had already seceded, no one shows up. So obviously that is not going to work itself out. There's also going to be kind of something else thrown out there, which is like, hey, look, what if we get an amendment or something in the Constitution that guarantees the right of slavery where it already exists? Rejected by the South, who just didn't think that was enough. It's very interesting to think about that, because essentially the South doesn't really even listen to this, but this compromise that they threw on the table was basically willing to protect slavery where it already existed for the next 50 years till 1910. But the South says no. Interesting that the South has that much confidence in themselves. Wow, craziness. At this point, though, again, we're not quite at war, because the North feels like time is on their side. They say, hey, look, we don't want to do anything to provoke the South. We're just going to be patient. We're just going to kind of let things occur. And then, hopefully, once they realize that this isn't some bigger movement, they'll come back in and we can come to agreement there and stuff like that. So that's the original kind of plan that comes into place. Lincoln finally takes over as president in March 1861, and his inaugural speech is a very significant speech, and it says kind of two major things. He was opposed to slavery expanding. So once again, he does not call for abolition. He just says no more expansion into the new areas. But he also will say that secession was illegal. Almost kind of like a warning to the southern states. Hey, look, what you've done is illegal. It's not allowed. It's now time for you to come back. The reality is, though, this is not enough for the South. They're not necessarily threatened at this point, but they also don't really care about slavery existing where it already exists. They want slavery to have the prospect of continuing on. And so by March 1861, we're not quite at war yet, but obviously things are moving very quickly towards there, as there hasn't been much of a really solid compromise coming into play. All right, here's Crittenden and his attempted compromise. And then you can see here some more stuff about this. Again, the amendment to protect slavery where it already existed, that was largely okay, at least for the North. And then expanding the Missouri Compromise line, that was rejected by Republicans, and that was a kind of a problem. So that didn't work out well for them. Again, the idea here that if you just say, hey, look, it's 36-30, they'll want to expand further south. And so, again, it's just kind of coming clear to many that if you're going to make this work, as far as westward expansion and as far as settling new places, you just can't have the prospect of slavery there. All right, well, thanks. That takes us right to the kind of before we're going to start the Civil War. One thing that's going to happen that's going to lead itself through, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. Thanks for listening. Talk soon, and watch the next one. Thanks.